it gets to something that we talked about, which is having to play the long game. This, not just the intentionality, but it's, COVID was a moment and a lot of flurry of activity. And from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of concerns around backsliding precisely because of what you were talking about with, well, the new sites, I don't know if they can do it. Maybe we're going to go back to the old way. It's more, and so I think one of the words we used when you were talking about this was resiliency, right? The need for resiliency, and in our leaders around that. And so, I just love to get, your thoughts on, how do we think about that resiliency and supporting, not just, you're all leaders, you're all living this, but you have many leaders that report up to you, and in many ways it's a ground game too. It's both at the top and the bottom of the organization. How are you thinking about cultivating that resiliency? Because it can get emotional and it can get personal, but it takes a long game. So Rob, if you could start there.
Sure. So it has to be part of our culture. For any organization, it's part of your culture and how you model those behaviors, right? I talked about early in my career how I didn't think about these things. I just had no idea, like when I came out of school, but there were models, people that I could model myself after, and you develop in a culture. So you have to set the culture right at the top, which means you have to be visible about it, right? And resiliency comes from, even when you get the pushback, that's when you develop bigger ears and a smaller mouth, right? And you listen more, right?
That's good.
I
love that. That's a great metaphor.
You spend more time listening and understanding, and when you can do that and engage, then you can understand more about what the things you need to do to be more resilient. It might be how words matter, as you're saying this, right? So what are the words we choose? And then how do you put that into action in the programs? Because really what we want is where we're not having conversations about this at some point because it's just part of the DNA, right? And whether it be in our workforce, or whether it be in how we conduct clinical trials, it's just how it's done. And you don't worry about sliding back because it's just, nobody could think about it any differently. And so it starts with us. We have to demonstrate that every day. I mentioned that quote, be strong in the saddle, right? So when it gets hard, right, you have to stay on and ride, right?
Yeah.
And demonstrate that you can do it. And so I think that it starts there.
Can I just add, I am a policy junkie. That's what I love doing, thinking about all day, every day. And the question of resiliency for me means there must be some considerations for carrots and sticks. And I know it's not popular probably, but just going back, like how do you build it in culture? A great example is just what happened with diversity action plans, I would have to say, which is that FDA put out guidance, 4 or 5, I can't even count how many, on diversity, equity, and clinical trials, which were a strong encouragement, gave ideas, recommendations, strategies, etc. But I have not seen this shift and movement by larger organizations, right, that are submitting and putting products or submissions in front of FDA without the diversity action plan requirement. I'm not saying it's perfect or it's a panacea and it covers it all, but just that one bit of a requirement has forced, you can clarify to me, internally for companies to say, what are we doing? Are we doing this? How do we put the infrastructure in place? How do we put the resources behind this? I see all kinds of hires right within companies now that they're like the diversity, equity, inclusion chief for clinical trials. Did we see this at this scale 4 or 5 years ago? Perhaps not. So that might be more of the stick component to some degree. But I think the carrot component is in some ways is the healthy competition. When one does it, they want to say, wait, I'm a leader in this area. And the peers look around and say, well, I want to be differentiated and I want to be a leader. So there is that positive reinforcement. But I just have to think from a policy perspective, we have to look at the full set of solutions. It's not just FDA. There's a bigger infrastructure around, or bigger set of players around clinical trials. It's also NIH, is also going to be on point of care and the primary sites. I think a big part of the last movers are the health plans. Where are they in this conversation in terms of funding, evidence generation on interventions that have good health outcomes? I haven't seen them be as big of a part of the conversation as we ought, especially in the post-market setting. So I agree, and I just wanted to add a little nuance there about some carrots and sticks from a policy perspective.
And I think policy sometimes lags. And what I mean by that is, and so I don't think about carrots and sticks, right? What I think about is, if you look at Transcelerate as an organization, we've been talking about diversity in clinical trials, we've been talking about inclusion for a very long time. And as member companies, we have been building plans together, we've been sharing data, like how are we going to do this? And in a way, I feel like sometimes the groundswell has to come from the bottom, and then you get sort of guidance in a policy that says, hey, this is how we're all going to do it, and then gets everybody else moving. And so I think of it more as a sort of an incentive to continue as opposed to the carrots and the sticks.
Sure. That might be the language. Use the right words.
Yes,
Language
matters. Yes.
We just had a healthy debate about how language matters.
And I was going to add too that I think it has to also move out. It's beyond clinical trials, right? It's then moving into care.
Yeah.
And I think this is an area where we struggle. Dissemination and implementation of findings that we have might go well at the particular sites that have done the trials, or understanding methods, development, et cetera. But then you look at how it gets implemented in other sites or doesn't, and you have to consider all of the infrastructure that goes into the thinking behind that. You can't just if you look at the electronic health records, if at one site they're completely different at another site. And so implementing something even within an electronic health record is a major deal. And so I think how we start to drive the infrastructure development towards supporting these ideas is really the critical need. And so how do we make that change so that it does get into the care?
It gets to something, and Janice, I'm going to call on you about this, is when we talk about the future vision for health, what we think clinical research needs to look like, it's the convergence of clinical research and clinical care, because that is when you start to get at the. And Janice, if you want to talk a little bit about how
we this didn't come up in our prep session, but I think this is where, I feel incredibly fortunate through Transcelerate, right? In terms of everything we do, we have such a big focus around how do we, in my words, right? How do we really think about aspirationally, instead of bringing patients to clinical research, how do we bring clinical research to patients? And then the infrastructure that needs to happen to really do it in a meaningful way. Much of what we do here at Transcelerate, and by the way, Transcelerate is not just the 21 member companies, right? It's really the ecosystem partners that all have throughout the decade supported our work. But really, how do we really think about evolving the patient's experience? You look around this table and then you think about we all have traveled a different path to get here. And then you think about people we interact with, they all have a different path. And then you apply that to the communities of people that we live with and interact with. In some ways, we're all at a different point when you think about clinical research and clinical care. And that is our aspiration. But how do we do it in a way that's truly meaningful at an individual level? Much of our work at Transcelerate has really been focused around how do we create processes and tools in a collaborative way so that we can proactively engage with patients in a meaningful way and get their feedback, get their on a consistent manner throughout the clinical research process. And I think more importantly, I will say, the need for policy to be part of the conversation is very key, because to get to that clinical convergence of clinical research and clinical care, we need Transcelerate is one entity, and we can continue to chip away and develop very pragmatic solutions, which is we have done, but there will be required actions by other parts of the ecosystem. And regulators, sites, patient groups, policymakers, that's our hope, Allison, and I think that we're starting to have that conversation, but we've set that bold vision and we are going to achieve it one step at a time, very pragmatic way. And we talked a little bit about resiliency. I do feel very incredibly fortunate through Transcelerate, where every day, right, change is hard. Change is really hard. But every day I get to see, our member companies working with ecosystems, stakeholders, just really coming together and do the right thing and demonstrating courage as well, courage to challenge ourselves, to say, why are we doing that? Why are we not doing it differently? What's the barrier? And then be resilient about, let's keep pushing forward. Let's keep pushing forward one step at a time.
And then how do we make sure we're not leaving the rural communities behind, the rare disease communities behind, who are invisible, and they have, they go to doctors all the time, but they're invisible in the electronic health record system because how they're built. And then ensuring that we can get to all of those communities. I think exactly how do we build in that resiliency there? And I think that's a challenge for us.
Yeah, well, I'll go along with Esther on this. You know, we got to call some of the other parties in the ecosystem to the table here, because we're all swimming upstream on this, because the huge inequities, rural and blah, 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 and so forth, they're built into our healthcare system in the United States. And so everything we're trying to do is pushing against this tide of, cost optimization, profit, all for-profit entities and so forth. So that is very difficult, and I do think we have to put that on the table repeatedly, of course, which I've done, of course.
A real surprise to me was, during the pandemic, where if you had a visit that was through telemedicine, right? CMS said, hey, we'll reimburse it the same.
Right.
But I always write about those things sliding, because in these communities, right, where you don't have a lot of these, if you want to bring care,
That's
right,
It's the only problem.
it has to be done a different way.
Right.
So to your point, we can't, sometimes we're trying to push it, but it's not sustainable, because when we're done, it disappears, right? I can drive a bus into the community, but when I'm done, well, my bus is leaving. So we got to think about what that will look like, the life cycle of care and all these things.
Well, tell what you just talked about, the telehealth, telemedicine, and the reasons that we eased on the prior, scope of practice issues and created some flexibilities was all around COVID. And COVID is waning, or it's happening to some degree, acknowledged, and some others not. But we need the next acute thing. And the next acute thing are multiple things, right? We have like an obesity epidemic in the country, and I would say probably in the world. We have a diabetes epidemic. We have all of these chronic diseases that are, in some ways, the trajectory is worse and not necessarily getting better.
That's right.
So how do we continue those flexibilities that worked very well for COVID? We need to tell a different story, which is rural communities are in crisis.
Yeah.
And we need to solve that crisis. And we cannot let go of the innovation, technology and otherwise, that we implemented for a very acute pandemic when we have multiple acute epidemics that are happening in the country. And these are the solutions that we tested. They worked. Let's redeploy them.
Right. It's interesting. I'm starting to visit some of the big retail chains and seeing what they're doing in the community. And honestly, I'm so impressed.
Yes.
Just because of how they're thinking, when you walk in, because these are individuals that may not have insurance or maybe underinsured.
Yep.
And I never know how much I'm paying for something. And I have to say, I probably have really good insurance, right? But you walk in, you can see on the board, right, what it's going to cost them and everything. I just found that really refreshing.
Right.
And the environment that I was in, it felt like I was really going to get good care there, right? It wasn't some dingy environment. And I thought to myself, if I lived in this community, I think I'd want to come here, right?
Yeah.
And it was really, I just think how others now are looking at it differently compared to maybe how I thought, maybe 5 or even 10 or maybe even 2 years ago, right? It's just really refreshing. And then you say, how can we get more involved in that? How can we use that as part of the system?
I'm with you. I mean, I've tried for years, as you know, to get a sort of behind-the-counter option for drugs, which the pharmaceutical industry oppose, right? Because, like, who walks into Walmart? People with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, people with untreated hypertension.
Right.
Okay, they could get treated. It's not that hard to get your blood pressure done or something. We need to take the care to where the community is. Then we could have, just like we did with, remember how everybody, when influenza, they said the pharmacists couldn't give vaccinations. That would be terrible. That would be the end of the world. Okay, that's the only reason we got all these people vaccinated, right? Is because we took it out to where people are, took it to the patients. So I think that to be really successful, we're going to have a different model of care in the United States that is mediated through, look at the success now of urgent care. A lot of people get their health care that way because it's almost impossible to get to see a doctor in a normal setting. So I do believe that some really rethinking of how we deliver the care, both the telehealth, but also with sites where people are and can get to, would really help. And then, because with precision medicine, for example, we're not going to be, it requires a larger patient base, okay? Because you only have a small fraction of people who've identified with the disease have that specific whatever it might be, that means you might be targeting them. And so we can't just go to the same sites all the time, traditional sites and their patient base. And we don't want to just go around and suck people out of the community, like you said. So it means we have to have a larger base of care, but that is, and with new technology, we could, that care can easily be connected to the most advanced researchers.
And there was something very interesting, and I'm not giving the names of any chains, but it was very interesting what I learned. Again, talk about having bigger ears and a smaller mouth. Okay, just understanding how things are done. Where my mom had diabetes, and she would always think, she'd say, my sugar, right? And she'd think, well, if I don't eat those donuts, I'm going to be fine,
That's right.
right? But what I learned in one of the chains when I was working with them was when they treat someone, then they have an app, and they walk into the food sections, and they show them what to eat and what not to eat. And I thought, that's what my mom needed, right? To know that don't hide from me the donuts in the oven, right? And think you're doing okay, right? But to know what types of foods to eat. And that's what really impressed me, which was, it was the circle. And really understanding people, not just the medication, but then all the follow through.
And to Esther's point, that's the incentive.
Yes.
Okay, because people want to go back to there because they're doing the whole care for the patient.
You know what else that it's addressing that we haven't talked about is the trust factor.
And the trust.
The trust, right? Because we can talk about trust from these communities don't trust us because we did everything wrong. We cite the studies that were very, very wrong for good reason. But when you implement these transformative care models, right? Care in the community, and you're there for the long haul, and you're working with a business partner that is trusted, right? I'm going in for my toilet paper. I'm going in for my toothpaste.
Exactly.
I know that and you've gone to them for years, and then you're now accessing healthcare services at a facility, a place that you trust. Then over time, that trust only continues to grow because they know that retailer is not moving. They're not leaving their community because they have been there. So I think we need to take the whole trust conversation and less about the negatives of what we did wrong and start to invest in these new models and also in the providers that are trustworthy, right? Pharmacists, that was a fantastic example. Pharmacists see these patients every single day. They can advise and say, I saw you last month when you came in to pick up your diabetes medicine, and I can also help you with your food as medicine prescription, right? How do we leverage pharmacists more? How do we leverage community health workers more? First of all, let's pay them. That would be fantastic. And then let's leverage them, right?
Sorry, exactly.
But
sorry, I was going to say that the whole concept of bringing it's stop fighting for the same patients. It's about
that's right. There's a whole universe.
There's a whole universe. We are all patients, right? And how do we bring research closer to the communities, to them? But I also think there's the aspect around getting just the mindset around. Right now we're managing diseases, but how do we get to the managing health? And that's that circle. Right? And then you working the trust model and making sure that the providers have the support, have the education, have the right incentives to really help us build that trust. We can't get to the patients in many ways without the providers.
Just one final thing on trust, and I know, Janet, you wanted to come in, which is that if you look at poll after poll, trust in science has gone down. Trust in institutions that are science-based institutions, unfortunately, has gone down. But trust in business is up. I mean, because people trust that if I order something online, it's coming to my house. If I go to a store, they're going to have what I need. How do we just leverage where trust is and build and grow it from a health perspective, rather than looking at where trust is not?
Well, I think we enable these new setups to actually perform care for the community. I think your example is great because they were incentivized to develop this app for their customers, to make their experience better, to help, and it was to help their health, and that can provide real innovation. You can't see a doctor's office developing an app about what to eat, in the store because. But they have the food and they have the pharmacy and so forth. So I do think Also, this will encourage more innovation. I mean, you could foresee, getting your genome scan done
Yeah.
there
You
and
could get retinal scans, actually.
all kind of things. Yeah,
Screenings. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
A gentleman in my group coined the term care anywhere.
Yeah.
And we stopped talking about decentralized trials or visits, and we just talk about care anywhere,
Right.
because then it can be in your home, it could be in the
That's
community,
right.
it can be anywhere.
That's
And I
right.
actually really like that term. I applaud him for that term because it makes you think differently,
Right.
right?
Yes.
It also empowers the person.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we think about empowering the clinicians or the providers, but empowering the person to actually then take this up is, some easy kind of way of looking at this and using these capabilities. It empowers them, and then they will want to continue to do more because they will see change.
It's interesting because the next question that I was going to pose to all of you, you beat me to it. So that's why I didn't intervene.
Just been chatting.